the idea of value reversal is the most important concept to grasp in understanding this parable. And so when we look at this, we understand that the story, the intent of the story is to teach the disciples something of value. Okay, let's get into this story then, the illustration of values. Parables are generally true-to-life topics, but they usually contain some exaggeration of details in order to cause the story to be more compelling, just like any writing of a good book, right? You have some kind of twist and something. I mean, if reality was based upon murder mysteries, we would live in a very scary place, because they're usually full of some kind of exaggeration. Same with this. For instance, the good man of the house, the master going out so many times throughout the day to find laborers, does not seem normal, and it wouldn't be normal in the culture. But its purpose is to show the intent of the first becoming last and the last becoming first. This is just a literary technique that our Lord employed here. He got an audience with this parable because usually at some junction in the parables there was a twist or a plot change that caused the audience to go, "What?" To hear and listen to the point of what he is saying. So culturally, in this story, the real-life portion, the part that would not be uncommon, would be for a landowner, a householder of some wealth, to hire day laborers to work in his vineyard. The day laborer culturally at that day was socially less than the slave. For this reason, the master who had slaves had to provide food and shelter for the slave. And so he was bound by certain laws to keep the slave healthy, not to abuse his slave. But those laws did not apply to the day laborers, and so many times day laborers were abused. Work hard hours for little money. And the day laborer was the lowest of the working class. There was a law, the Jewish law, that a day laborer had to be paid his measly wages, usually 1 denarii, like it said right here, be paid his measly wages because they needed it before sunset, because they needed it to survive the next day. It was subsistence living. It wasn't making a living off of day laboring. It was, I've got no job, I've got to eat, I've got to go do the day laboring. That's the way it was. So these are the kinds of people we're talking about right here. The day laborer was one of not making much progress in life, so to speak. But where the twist element, the spiritual element of the story, which would twinge in the mind of the listeners, is when at the end of the day, everyone was paid the same amount, beginning with the one who worked the least amount of time. That's what's unusual. So in this story, we have a landowner who hires day laborers in the morning at 9, at 12, at 3, and then at 7. The average work day was about 12 hours. So it'd be from 6 to 6, but sometimes they go longer than that as well. The workers, and at the end of the day, they expected their pay, so they'd line up and get their pay. The first one in this story agreed upon a denarius for the day. The others never agreed on anything in the story. The master simply said, "That which is right, I will pay you." At the end of the day, as they line up, and in a twist of fate, the one who only worked an hour gets paid first. Master never said anything to the workers. But as these ones who came early in the morning began to observe what was going on, they started to get a little excited, because that guy worked an hour and he got a denarius. Let's see, we worked, wow, this is going to be great. And so they're just waiting and they're waiting, and they get to their turn and they get a denarius. And they get angry. This is unfair. This is unjust. Notice what it is that makes them angry. Verse 12. It's not that they got paid the salary, but what makes them angry? These last have wrought but 1 hour, and notice this, and thou hast made them equal unto us. It wasn't what they got paid or didn't get paid that bothered them. It was that they got paid a certain amount and the others got paid the same amount. In fact, it was the comparison aspect that bothered them the most. This is unjust. This is unfair. And you know what? I can sympathize with these workers. In fact, that's what turned me into a capitalist as a young man. When I was working my first job and the minimum wage went up. And the guy who just started got the same I was making. And I'd worked there for 2 years. I thought, this is unfair. This is unjust. I can sympathize here. So we see a problem. They're complaining, they're murmuring, because when they see what the others had received, it doesn't seem right. Okay, I got to say, tough parable. Hard to understand. In fact, it has been said by commentators that this is the single most difficult parable spoken by Jesus Christ for interpreters. There are varieties of interpretations of this parable. Reading through and trying to understand it and understand the different things was somewhat of a laborsome task this week. Just want you to know. I think I've understood it correctly. But first, before we get into that, I want to just quickly give you some wrong interpretations of it. Okay, first of all, this parable is not about salvation or grace. Grace is not bestowed on any of the workers because all of them worked for what they received. And grace is the absence of work. Grace is a gift. So this is not about grace. The master's not showing grace here or lack of grace. Salvation is a gift of God. Therefore, this is not about salvation because people work. Conversely, many misuse verse 16, many are called but few chosen, to twist, kind of dilute this and make it seem like that's about salvation. But that verse is not even about salvation. It's not about salvation. If Christ, the statement by Christ in the parable is not about salvation or grace because he's talking about the first being last, last being first, it seems rather, if this is about salvation, where's the aspect of faith? That's always present when God presents the gospel. Faith. That's not even here. Even though this parable is not about grace, it's also not primarily about the goodness of the master. That's a part of it. That's a subset of it, but that's not the main point. We do see goodness here, right? He was good in that he gave them wages, but not overly gracious, not overly good. Because if that was the case, the parable would probably say something more like the guy who was forgiven of all his debts, some huge amount. But here it's it's what the day laborer could expect to have. So it's not about the overt goodness either. This parable, this one may seem weird to you, was weird to me. This parable is not about different stages of human history. That's what some have suggested. Each of these hours is a different stage in human history and man's different working through the... Boy, you have to do some interesting interpretation gymnastics to come up with that kind of stuff. Some have said this parable is about Jews and Gentiles, and the first were the Jews and the last were the Gentiles, and God was reversing it. But that same thing, there's nothing in the context that would indicate that at all. It's not talking about Jews and Gentiles or the church in that sense. What Christ, I believe, is teaching in this parable correspond to the previous issue concerning the values of the world. And true disciples of Jesus Christ, the servants in the parable, the ones who are serving, the disciples of Jesus Christ, must have a different set of values than the world. These that complained and murmured had the wrong set of values. I'll try to explain that in just a moment. The Master, Christ, is good in that He gives to the needs of His servants. He gave them what they needed. When it says, I will give you what is right, a lot of times our minds immediately think that, okay, I'll give you what is just, therefore there is some comparison I must make that to. Don't we do that normally? What is just in our minds is almost always dependent on comparing it to someone else. We have a hard time understanding justice without comparing it. But in the Master is no comparison. It's what is right according to Him. And so He did what was right. They needed a denarius to live. He gave them a denarius to live. And He was good and right to the ones who worked an hour because you know what? Maybe He didn't work all day, but they still needed a denarius to live. And so He gave them a denarius to live. He was good. He was right. Our flesh, even as born-again Christians though, raises its ugly head and we become just like the first workers. We get, according to verse 15, an evil eye. Literally idiomatically that phrase, evil eye, means jealous eye. Green with envy. Envy, jealousy, covetous. The values of the disciple can get skewed if we take our focus off of the goodness of the Master in providing for the need and put it on the other workers. Christians, disciples, we will get an evil eye when we get our focus off of the goodness of our Master and get it on others and what they have or don't have and what we don't have or have.